Hello students! Today we're going to continue with the Dunn and Halonen book. We're going to move over to chapter 3. This chapter is all about should you major in psychology. So might you be a good fit? What skills might you need? Those kinds of things. Hopefully it helps you get a little more excited, have a little more plan of what you should do in prepping for your career. And also for some of you, you might realize, hey, it doesn't really seem like I'll be a good fit in psychology. And that's great. Learning that earlier on is better if you don't think you actually want to continue with psychology. So with that, the first section of the book talks about personality traits and personality assessments and like career assessments and ideas, and those can be good tools, but I want to go on a little bit of a tangent and maybe a little bit of a rant for a second about the term personality traits. So when social psychology started looking into personality traits, they thought of them as these unchangeable aspects of a person. So let's take an example of extroversion versus introversion. That someone was either extroverted or introverted, and that was unchangeable no matter what kind of situation they were in. If you saw it when they were 5, they would still be that way when they were 10. If you saw it when they were 20, they'd still be that way when they're 30. When you saw it if they were 40, they'll still be that same way in 60. So they thought of these traits as something that was really unchangeable. That was something that you kind of had, maybe you developed very early on. There were ideas of maybe how social psych didn't really focus on how it developed. Developmental psych people were looking at that. How did you develop these aspects of yourself? Sorry, a few too many tangents I'm trying to take us on here. The main point was it started out in social psychology as an idea that this aspect of yourself would be pretty much the same. You could be pretty well predicted to use your extroversion or use your introversion in whatever situation you were found in. That being said, as more and more work went into this, they began to realize, well, it doesn't actually fit all situations. So someone who's extroverted in one situation might be introverted in another situation. Maybe 3 years later, a situation they were extroverted in before, they're being introverted in now. So realizing that, oh, these things that we consider traits, unchangeable, do actually have a considerable amount of change. So while social psychologists realize that, they still call them traits. It kind of has that baggage of something being unchangeable. Versus developmental psychologists, oftentimes we call them characteristics. So still describing the same thing, like say extroversion or introversion, but it doesn't have that baggage of being something unchangeable, that's where the personality trait research started with. They figured if you could know, some researchers thought there were 200 personality traits, others thought there were over 2,000, some thought there were like under 20, but if you could know all of someone's traits, you could predict exactly how they would behave in any given situation. So trying to narrow down these variables to try and pinpoint unchangeable things. But people change over time. That's what developmental psych is all about. So you change, you're going to change intentionally, you're going to change unintentionally throughout this course, throughout your schoolwork, throughout your life. So because of that, these things that we might see as so core and central to who a person is right now, in a couple of years, or in a different situation, that might be very different. They might behave very different, and so there's a lot of other variables that go into how people change, develop, and act. And I think that's exciting. The models of socio-emotional development, bioecological systems theory, these models that we've shown, all the circles and all the arrows interacting with each other, that's fascinating to me. Saying, oh, there's so many pieces of this puzzle. Let's understand these pieces of the puzzle. And yes, more complicated than saying, hey, there's these 25 traits that we can absolutely predict exactly how you'll be. Say, well, no, there's probably like a billion variables, and if we know more about them, yeah, we'll be able to predict pretty well. So a little bit of a tangent, but definitely relevant to things like career assessments. While you might feel like you have certain skills now, or an assessment says you have a certain skill, you can still build that skill. Or if it says you don't have a skill, you can build that skill. You can build character strengths, you can gain capacities, you can change in different ways to fit you better, to fit the work better, whatever you're trying to do. So with that, these career assessments might be good tools. Feel free to use them, but they're not going to be the end all be all of exactly who or what you should do forever in your life. So whatever tools you use to find it, find fit with your occupation. So find ways to fit your skills or build skills that you want to gain to what you want to do. So things that can help with that are things like shadowing. So follow around people who do that kind of work. Ask them questions about it. See what they feel are important skills or abilities within that area. So these are things that you can then say, oh, I have that, and I have that, but I don't have this one, so maybe I should get more training on that or work on that, something like that. Similar with speaking to professionals in the field, I had a course where essentially we interviewed people who were in the career we thought we would go into and asked them about, well, how did they get to their career? What was kind of the path there? What do they think are important aspects that or skills that they have? What trainings did they have outside the classroom? Those kinds of things. And that was really useful, but you don't have to do that as a class requirement. You can find professionals in the field and email them, ask them, see if they would be willing to talk to you. Many of them probably would. So doing an internship, learning about a field by actually trying to do the work. Internships and shadowing are pretty similar. Usually with shadowing, you're kind of there but not actually interacting. Internship, you're more hands-on working with things, but it also depends on the structure of the internship and the shadowing. If you're an undergraduate working in a clinical psych ward of a hospital, you're probably not actually interacting with patients very much, for example. So even though it might be called an internship, it might be a little more shadowing because you don't have the training to actually interact with these individuals. So you can also do things like read books or watch videos and interviews from people in the field talking about their experience in the field. And that can let you know, hey, do you feel like you're a good fit for that career? Are there things you want to build in yourself to be a good fit? Or is there an area of the field that you didn't realize existed that you think you would be a really good fit for? Those could be all really good things. And most of these things, shadowing, internships, speaking to professionals, these are things that you will probably in all programs have to go and do on your own. So very few programs in, say, bachelor's programs have a requirement to do an internship. Usually it's an additional thing on top of your coursework. So your school might advertise, hey, there's this internship available, but you will have to take the initiative, apply for that, seek out these additional opportunities to build the skills that you want to make a career what you want. So job crafting, essentially. So again, most of the coursework gets you kind of the book knowledge, gets you some application. You might even have, so like a lot of child development programs will have, say, a child lab where you watch and you do behavioral work with the children, things like that. But beyond those things, getting these additional experiences, getting research experiences will mostly be you yourself taking the initiative to get that. So one thing you could do is ask your instructors what's available. So ask them, hey, in this area, what are places that have taken interns for clinical practice? What are places that are doing research? And hopefully, especially if you ask someone who's lived in the area longer, I say that because I had a student after this lecture last year come and ask me, hey, what areas do you know around here? I'm like, I don't know. I've lived here a year now. You probably know places better than me. And I felt really bad that I couldn't really share with them. Because I didn't know. I didn't have many connections in the area. But most full-time faculty that have lived in an area for longer, they know the kinds of places that have done internships or done shadowing and things like that. So ask them. I mean, feel free to try and ask me too. Doesn't mean I'll necessarily know, but ask all of your instructors. And then if 2 out of 8 of them know something, then that gives you 2 routes to go onto. All right, so let's talk about meaning, money, motivation to do your work, and how they're all related. So we talked about this in Dunn Halonen in Chapter 2 about a study that showed essentially if you make $75,000 a year in the US at that time, any more money than that did not increase your well-being. And we talked a little bit about how that's not a full picture of this picture. And I mentioned some slides. Now I'm going to go to it right now, where I had highlighted a few things. And I'm like, where was that? It's because it was in this chapter that I was planning to go into that more additional detail. And I'll actually copy this over to the other lecture too, but it's really good. So with this, one thing I want to emphasize is that one of the main findings since then is that work-life balance is a really important aspect of well-being, subjective well-being, feeling like you have people that you can be around or want to be around, or hobbies that you want to do, or having experiences that you want. That kind of work-life balance really increases subjective well-being. So the claim that as people make more money, the time they need to devote to work increases substantially has a lot of problems. And so that is from your book, basically suggesting that as people are making more money, they need to devote more work as they're making more money. It's not exactly true. The people that make the very most money in the world are working things that you and I might consider work the least. People that make very little money tend to be working like actual hours of labor more than people making a whole lot of money. So many people are already working incredibly high hours. So the very wealthy don't actually devote many hours to tasks that you and I might consider work. So more recent research is better at looking at more of these variables when it comes to meaning, well-being, money, things like that. So we showed this abstract before. I pointed out a few things. Here are some of these highlights. So again, socioeconomic status, and they included income and educational attainment. So for this, how they operationalize this variable, what income were you making, and also factoring in what was your education. If you had higher education and lower income, you might be matching someone who was making higher income but had lower education. I think I might have said the same thing twice. But basically, the number was not just the income that they were making. Another thing is subjective well-being. How happy and satisfied with life do people feel like they had? So again, it was a lot of studies. Sorry, I felt like I was about to sneeze. There was a lot of studies, very many participants overall, and some of the main things that they found were that the associations between socioeconomic status and well-being strengthened in samples that were increased population dense areas. So that relationship existed more in areas with more population density. When there was less income inequality, the association between income and life satisfaction were higher, but in an area where there was a lot of income inequality, that association sometimes didn't exist at all. And then if there were if you felt like there was possible social mobility, that you could move up or down in social classes, then your life satisfaction, your subjective well-being tended to be higher as well. But for people, even making $80,000 or $90,000, if they're making that much money, but they're in an area with a lot of income inequality, and they don't feel like there's much social well-being or social mobility, their well-being overall was not as high. So there's other things that impact, basically other life things, other factors in the area, the economy, the context around you that affect how much meaning or well-being you might have in your life. So here is a good graph from that. Education and income were kind of how they perceived their, and then also what was their perceived socioeconomic status. So what did the researchers had a number. It was probably just a number from like 1 to 10 that they ranked them on socioeconomic status or something like that. But then what was their perceived socioeconomic status? Did they feel like they were a higher status than they actually were, or a lower status? And that has a big impact, especially if you feel like you're lower status and you don't feel like there's social mobility. That's going to impact your well-being. If you feel like you're stuck in a hole and you can't ever dig out of it, that's going to affect your well-being, right? So versus the opposite, if you feel like it's really easy to change and improve things, then your subjective well-being might be different. So let's jump to talking about meaning specifically, and we'll talk about purpose as well a little bit. So meaning, or things that are meaningful, are really related to intrinsic motivation. So that's one thing that we definitely try to instill in a lot of psych students, is an intrinsic motivation, a feeling of meaningfulness in the work that you're doing. Because all of what we do in psychology is around people. So psychology is the study of human behavior, how humans think, how humans make decisions, and this is all really relevant to how humans live. So if we're trying to help people have thriving in their lives, that can be a really meaningful thing. So purpose itself is a little bit different. You could say that it's a smaller umbrella. So we have things that are meaningful, that are significant to yourself. Purpose has to add goals and contribution to the world beyond yourself. So purpose is meaning plus goal orientation plus this contribution to people beyond yourself. So let's look at a couple examples. I do hope you find your work in psychology meaningful, but not everyone is going to find it purposeful. Not everyone is going to have the kind of long-term goals that it takes to make it a purpose, or feel like they're contributing beyond themselves that make it a purpose. But hopefully, at the very least, you find meaning in the work is one of my hopes. So not everybody will find purpose in the work of psychology, and that's okay. Oftentimes purposes are like really central to what we want to do and who we feel we are, versus things that are meaningful are engaging and intrinsically motivating, but not necessarily quite as central. So there are benefits of purpose. People who have a purpose in life tend to have more healthy identity development as they're developing their identity, and that happens essentially from about the time you're a teenager to throughout your life. You're always changing identity and having identity development. Development basically just means change. So if you become a parent, your identity is probably changing in that sense, for example. So they tend to feel like they have more meaningful academic experiences. So people who have a sense of purpose feel like even with a busy work task, they see it as meaningful because it's building certain skills within a certain kind of realm that they can then use for this thing that's really purposeful to them. Purpose helps foster a connection with others because to be a purpose, it has to be affecting other people. Generally, that is that you're actually working with people in some way or doing something for others in some way. It builds self-efficacy. As you're working on something, you get better at it, and seeing that you're improving on things and building skills makes self-efficacy go way up. And self-efficacy is way better than self-esteem. If you build self-efficacy, self-esteem will also go up. But self-efficacy is kind of one of the focuses that we try to build and instill in students, is see, hey, look, you can build and gain new skills because you can. Greater positive affect, so that's like positive feelings like happiness, joy, and resilience. So if you have a setback, but something is really purposeful to you, you tend to be able to bounce back even amidst challenges a little better. And so that can be really good. We could go on more tangents about resilience training, but let's focus on meaning and purpose. So purpose does have really great benefits, and careers in the psych field do tend to lend themselves well to doing things with a purpose. So my work, I really find it purposeful by helping create tools to help people be more pro-social and help one another. I find that really purposeful. So basically comes down to helping others, essentially. So that's really purposeful, but not everybody has that purpose. A lot of people, I hope, have the meaning. So again, purpose, it has to be meaningful. So it has to be something you find useful or relevant or good. It has to be goal oriented. That's both long-term and short-term goals. And then it has to be for people beyond the self. So some common purposes that are beyond the self, and that's one thing that is really critical for meaning versus purpose, is family. A lot of people find purpose in their family. And so whatever career you have might affect your purpose towards family. It's one of the most commonly discussed ones from people who talk about their purpose. So that's obviously beyond yourself. There's other members of your family, so it's beyond yourself. You have goals towards them, continuing the relationship. You find relationships with them meaningful. So that is why family is one of the most commonly cited purposes people have. Helping the environment is another common purpose people have. That's beyond yourself. That's for the environment, for the world. It might be for people within the world. So working towards some kind of political activism can be an example of a purpose. You're working to, in this picture, end violence against women. So it's for other people. You have goals, long-term, short-term. It's meaningful to you. You feel it's important. So political activism can be a really good example of purpose. Arts are also a really good example of purpose. Oftentimes you're maybe doing art just for you. Maybe you find it meaningful, but if you have a sense of, I want to put out this art into the world to maybe continue my culture or make the world a more beautiful place or give this message to people or help support people with my art or something like that, that's a thing beyond yourself. You have these goals that are beyond yourself. That changes it from being just meaningful to being a purpose in life. So, and you can have more than one purpose in life as well. So with this, the psych careers that you could choose do lend themselves well to having a purpose in them. But again, you don't have to have a purpose in psychology. You can, I do hope that you at least find the work in psychology meaningful, that it's something you're intrinsically motivated, you want to do, and you find it useful and interesting. I do hope it's meaningful for you. If you can find purpose in it, it's even better. But just having it be meaningful is kind of the bar that I'm hoping everyone in my classes reach. So, what are some things that you will gain from your psychology training? So specifically in your courses, and then especially if you're taking those additional steps to do things like internships. So strengthening your self-regulation. So this can happen in other majors as well, but definitely in psych we focus a lot on regulation. You're doing an online class that takes a lot of planning and things like that. Especially in clinical programs, you do actually explicit coursework and training for building better work-life balance. So we try to help with that in other areas as well, but especially if you go into, say, a master's or a doctoral program for clinical practice, they're going to have literal classes about how to balance work and life. The things that you learn to help others can also help apply to you. So learning skills to help young children's emotion regulation can help with your emotion regulation. Again, these classes are not therapy. They're not taught in a way to help with individual personal problems or to explicit, other than my skills training lecture. That one I kind of have done explicitly to train you to, hey, here's a couple tools you can use. Most things are, we're learning about the tools and using with other people. But in that way, you could learn from them and apply them to yourself. We do hope we are enhancing leadership ability of our students. We try to give skills and opportunities to practice leadership. So doing individual group research, individual and group work, maybe even assigning a group leader in different classes and different programs. That can really help with leadership ability, which can be very useful in many areas, even outside of psychology. So hopefully you're improving your communication skills. This specific class that I'm recording this lecture for, we focus a lot on written communication skills in this specific class. Some of your other classes will focus on oral presentation skills and communicating in other ways. So a person-to-person interaction is a focus in essentially all psych classes. But also we learn about things like cultural, family, epigenetic, and neurodivergent differences that people might have to help us interact with people better in different ways. So if you understand cultural differences, you might be able to communicate better. If you understand someone is neurodivergent, maybe ADHD or autism, you might be able to communicate with that person a little better, or you might learn skills for you communicating with others. So it can really help improve communication skills to better understand people and all the complex things that go into making a person who they are. So hopefully you're also deepening your empathy in psychology. So essentially empathy is both feeling what someone else might be feeling as well as being able to put yourself in their shoes to take their perspective. So it's more than just a feeling. It's feeling, being able to share that emotion, but also being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, looking at it from someone else's point of view. So hopefully you are gaining that as we're learning more about people, people's experiences, what goes into development of people, things like that. So that can help improve working with all people, because everybody you meet is going to be different than you in some certain ways, and being able to work with them will help in any field. So one of the best ways to increase empathy also is to solve problems with others. So if there's maybe a tough time between you and a coworker, if you solve a problem together, you're going to deepen your empathy for that person. It's a good way to do this. So hopefully from psychology you'll gain better decision making abilities. So one of the things that we teach a lot is about the cognitive shortcuts humans take. And we make a lot of them all the time. Our sensation and perception does it. Making decisions, we do it all the time. We take a lot of cognitive shortcuts. We talked about some of these in the study tips, for example. And so knowing these things, we can hopefully avoid some of these cognitive shortcuts in making good decisions for our lives, for people that we're working with, things like that. So we might be able to understand common distorted perceptions. So what are we usually think we make I should have reviewed these terms so I get them right. We tend to think others make decisions based off of some internal characteristic. We often apply our decisions. We say, oh, it was because of these outside factors, when in reality it's always a combination of internal and external factors. So in some cases it can be better to say, rather than, oh, that person made that decision that was harmful or hurtful because they're bad internal person, versus saying, oh, they had these factors around them too. So it might help you be a little more empathetic in those kinds of ways, and maybe help you make better decisions as well. So understanding research on human behavior can also help us find valid research and how to help in a lot of different ways. So that's a skill that I hope students take away from my courses, is a better understanding of where to find good research, like the library tools, Google Scholar, to actually find good valid resources to answer questions rather than using pop psychology or things like that. Hopefully we are giving you all better memory skills and student abilities, because those kinds of abilities will help you throughout your life. We had an entire class in 2010 for how to build memorization and study skills. Cognitive psych classes is where most of these insights came from, so that can help a lot too. You'll learn about healthy behavior in your life. Basically, lifespan development course is all about how to live and thrive throughout lifetime, so you can apply that to your own life. It's from that I recognize, oh, hey, I probably need to exercise more now because of bone loss that might happen in the future, those kinds of things. Physical, social, and emotional well-being are discussed in lifespan development classes, so hopefully just by learning about these things, our students are behaving more healthily in their own lives. So we've got some positive things that you'll gain, some things about the field, about meaning and purpose. What are some reasons not to major in psychology? So many students who come into my classes think that they will go into clinical practice, therapy of some sort with a master's or maybe a PsyD, and actually be interacting one-on-one with people. So this you might call the clinical or bust major, that's the only goal, just do clinical work. And a lot of people come in with that as kind of the goal. Sometimes that's because that's the only job they know psychologists do. So hopefully now you know quite a few other jobs that psychologists do. But a clinical or bust major is not a good reason to major in psychology. One reason for that is that undergrad psych classes focus on getting the basics of all areas of psychology, or as many as we possibly can. So we get the basics of a lot of stuff, versus you won't have very many clinical focused classes, and a lot of people get really upset or disappointed that that's the case. So we're trying to get a broad view of psychology overall, and all that's going to be relevant to clinical practice. But it's not until you get to, say, a master's level that you really focus on the clinical practice. So if you really want to learn about clinical practice, you're going to have to go through a major in psychology before you get to that focus. So that can be really disheartening for students who just want the clinical information. So I've had a lot of students be disappointed by how few clinical focused classes there were. So when you have a general psych class and only maybe 2 lectures are on clinical psych and abnormal psych, they can be really disappointed, and it can be really frustrating. But there's a whole lot of other things that psychologists do, so I've got to give you a sense of all those different things. So with this, there are different classes that are going to be more clinical focused. So abnormal psych is going to be very clinical focused. Psychopathology, if a school offers that, is going to be pretty clinical focused. Sports psychology is a lot more about treatment. Health or stress psychology is going to be a lot more focused on actually treatment of individuals. So those are classes you might want to look for if you do feel like you might be that clinical or robust major, but my recommendation would be try to think of the other ways that you could learn in psychology. There's other things that you're going to be learning that are going to apply to an eventual clinical practice if that is where you go. So many individual courses, like let's say lifespan development, might touch on clinical topics like throughout it as well. So be happy with those little touches on the things, even though it's maybe not as deep as you would want to go, and use the skills that you know for finding research to dive into the topics more in depth. So with this, don't close yourself off to the main point of this clinical bus major, like don't be that, is don't close yourself off to other avenues of helping people within psychology. There are so many ways to use psychology to help people. It doesn't have to be only clinical practice, one-on-one, or in a group therapy type of setting. So here's a couple other ideas. Education uses a lot from psychology. Doing research in education, one of my colleagues has a master's degree in psychology and a master's degree in education. They're really well related. Doing evaluation, so evaluation on programs or policies or a company's new practices to see if it helps people. These are other ways to use psychology to help people. You can use psychology to help improve work environments. I mentioned policy with evaluation because it is really tied to these things. I mean, you could do evaluation in education, policy, and work environments. But trying to work and make better policies based on what you know about human development and how contexts interact with each other is a very good way to help people. Other things are community health interventions. So this isn't just like group therapy, but there's community health interventions trying to decrease the use of using needles twice for people who are using drugs, or creating interventions in the community, changing parks in different ways. There's one video that I show in some of my classes about community interventions where essentially near bus stops they had kind of a little playground, like a little area to sit, move around the space, and they saw an increase in people's well-beings within the city after they had made that change, because a lot of people were commuting on, say, like buses and trains in this place, which also in and of itself tends to be better than driving our individual cars. But I'm going to get too far on a tangent. But we can use the psych knowledge that we have to find out, hey, what's better, driving cars or having trains that go right to your work? Trains are good. Public transportation tends to be one thing that can really help people's well-being go up. Anyway, I am going too much into a tangent there. For the clinical or bus major, yes, you might end up doing clinical work, but you also might do an internship and find out that you're not well suited for it. That actually happened to me. I wasn't a clinical or bus major, but I thought that might be one avenue that I wanted to go into for helping people in psychology. And I did an internship and I realized I was getting burned out very, very quickly. So within just the internship that lasted a year. And so I realized, oh, this kind of work, I'm taking it home more than I should be. So this isn't actually the avenue I want to take. But knowing that there were these additional options let me know that there were a lot of ways to help people with psychology. So another reason not to major in psychology, if you're very anti-science, it's not a great major for you. So hopefully, as we've talked about now, psychology is a science. So if you very much don't like science or don't want to learn science, it's going to be a harder major for you. So with this, in all of your classes, especially this class and methods classes, you'll be learning how to do and how to understand science. You'll be examining the relationships between variables. You'll be looking at, are the research methods consistent? You'll be learning to use consistent research methods. You'll be reading and writing and using statistics. So if those things don't sound fun to you, then maybe a psych major is not a great fit. You can build reading skills, you can build writing skills, you can learn statistics skills, and there's a lot of resources on every campus I've worked with to help with all of those things. You're going to be taking time to do things in a very accurate way to figure out what is the best method. You'll be talking about, so these two studies did these things. This one used this method, this one did this method. To me, that's like super exciting. That's super fun to talk about. That's why I try to teach a lot of the science and like research methods focused classes. But if you don't want to do that stuff, it's going to be a harder major for you. Creativity is also very core to good science. So people might not realize that, but knowing like these are the methods we've used before, these are the way we've done things before, coming up with a new creative way to put those together or add something to it so that we learn something new, that's another way to use creativity. I often think we think of creativity as like doing art or something like that, and it definitely is. But there's other ways to apply creativity. Computer programmers use creativity. Physicists use creativity. Chemists use creativity. Biologists use creativity to think about and do science and the work that they do. It's a very human thing to be creative. So if you are not willing to do or learn science, the major will be difficult. I hope to make you excited about the science and learn more about it, because it's something I'm really excited about. So I hope I instill that in all the students who come through my classes. But if right now at the moment you're a very anti-science person and you're not willing to learn or do science, then it's going to be harder classes because we're always going to be talking about science. So another one is an anti-reading major. So don't major in psych if you're anti-reading. That being said, we'll get to a couple things here. Most of psych knowledge is delivered through written material, and we've talked about some of the weaknesses with that it is a little inaccessible. So this research article that I wrote, it's not at a high school reading level, right? So a high school student who goes and reads this, it might be a little difficult for them. Right? So with that, if you don't want to read, then, and that's the thing, if you don't want to read, if reading is difficult for you in different ways, there's many tools to help with that. But most psych knowledge is delivered through written material. You can listen to a lot of psych material. You can use programs. So you can get your own programs that can say, read this article to you. You can get it through, so like Disability Services as well has access to those programs for students that you can, I've had students had their exams read to them, like as they do the exam kind of thing. So there are lots of tools, there are lots of helps to help you be able to succeed in that reading, build new skills, build new tricks to be able to, since we have so much written material, that you can get it. So if it's hard for you, we've got some solutions. Psychologists have tried to find ways to help so that you can get that information. But if you don't want to read, that's a little different thing, because there's going to be a lot of written material delivered to you. So with that, you will need to read, comprehend, and incorporate lots of ideas in, say, writing your paper. So the minimum of 7, I forget for this, I think 7 for this class that I'm recording this for, a minimum of 7 research studies as your reference list is actually really small. So when you're looking at, say, an actual published research article. So generally, to get a good understanding of a subject, you need to do a lot more reading than just 7 articles. Now, your requirement, because of the time we have in the class and whatnot and all the skills we're trying to build, you only have to do 7 research studies in your reference list. But just know that to get a full understanding of a field, you generally need to read a whole lot more articles in that area. So with that, if you're not wanting to read, that would be the problem. If reading is a difficult thing for you for whatever reason, so whether it's vision, learning disability, whatever it is, we've got tools that we want to help you with those things. So that we're not saying, hey, you can't do it if you have a learning disability. No, we're saying, hey, if you don't want to do the work in psychology, which a lot of it is reading or comprehending these ideas that are often written or delivered to you, like through it being read to you, if you're not willing to do that, that's what we're talking about. So we definitely have a lot of tools that we want people to succeed and get that material read to them or delivered to them in a way they can comprehend. So that's what I mean by these things of not majoring in psychology. We've got the clinical or bust major. If that's the only thing you ever foresee yourself doing, it might be challenging because a lot of the undergrad classes up through your bachelor's are not going to focus on all that clinical stuff that you're really interested in. That doesn't mean that you can't do extra research on the side and learn more about any clinical topic that comes up in the classes. But I've seen students get disappointed. If you don't want to do science or learn science, it's going to be a harder major too. Or if you don't want to do the reading or learning through the written material that's required, it's going to be a little harder as well. So I think that is the end for this chapter. Yep, these are the questions in your discussion board for this week. So hopefully this has given you some ideas. Honestly, I think next time I teach this, I'm going to flip the not stuff to the beginning and then end with a little more positive things, like what are the things that psychology is going to actually give you. So psychology will deliver you and provide you with a lot of different skills that you can use in psychology, as well as a lot of different other fields. So hopefully you take those opportunities, as well as make yourself additional opportunities to do things like internships or shadowing, so you can build more skills as well.